Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a really interesting look into Christian missions to Islam, but specifically through an Asian lens.
That's right. We're working primarily from a piece of research titled 01 Through Christianity Missions to Islam, an Asian Perspective.pdf. The author uses the name Ben Abraham, a pseudonym we understand, for anonymity.
Yeah, and our aim here isn't just to rehash old stories. We really want to dig into the historical background and, maybe more importantly, highlight some, well, pretty surprising things happening right now.
Exactly. Moving beyond the usual headlines to give you a, let's say, more nuanced picture of these complex interactions.
And speaking of surprising, get this statistic from the research drawing on David Garrison's work. It talks about movements of Muslims turning to Christianity.
Oh, yeah. That one's a real eye-opener.
Right. So in just the first 12 years of this century, the 21st, he documented 69 of these major movements.
69. Compare the entire 20th century where there were only 11.
And just 2 in the 19th century. Before that, basically none that met his criteria.
And we should clarify what he means by a major movement, shouldn't we? It's not just a few people.
Good point. His definition is pretty specific. Either 1,000 baptisms recorded or 100 new churches started, all within about a 20-year span.
So, yeah, these are significant shifts we're talking about. The scale of the increase recently is, well, it's remarkable. It makes you really want to understand what's going on.
Okay, so to understand the present, we probably need to look back a bit. Let's talk about the history, the historical encounters. I think for many people, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, tension. Conflict, even.
That's definitely a common perception, and there's a basis for it, historically speaking. Starting around the 7th century, Islam expanded rapidly out of Arabia.
Right, into areas that were largely Christian at the time, like the Middle East, North Africa.
Precisely. And that expansion continued, pushing into Europe, Spain, Sicily, parts of Italy. We have major events like the Battle of Tours in 732.
Which kind of marked a limit to that push into Western Europe at the time.
Mm-hmm. And then, much later, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. That was huge.
And you can't talk about this history without mentioning the Crusades, can you? They loom so large.
Oh, absolutely. They're pivotal. You have the First Crusade starting around 1095, the capture of Jerusalem. Then centuries of conflict right up to the fall of Acre in 1291, which essentially ended the major Crusader presence.
Now, our source mentions Stephen Neal's view on a crusade's impact.
Yes, Neal argued they were pretty damaging overall, not just in embittering Christian-Muslim relations for centuries, which they certainly did, but also damaging relationships between Eastern and Western churches.
Right, the internal Christian dynamics.
Exactly. And Neal even suggested they kind of lowered the moral standards in Christian Europe at the time, a quite negative assessment.
But the research also brings in another historian, Jonathan Riley Smith, who offers a bit of a counterpoint, doesn't he?
He does. Riley Smith focuses more on the initial justification, arguing it stemmed from what he calls Muslim aggression. He points to the difficulties and harassment faced by Christian pilgrims trying to visit the Holy Land.
So not just a simple case of unprovoked Christian aggression.
That's his argument. And his conclusion is quite stark, really. He suggests that when you look at the terrible things done by both sides during that era, the blame was, and I quote him here, about even.
No, about even. That definitely complicates the narrative we often hear, doesn't it?
It really does. It pushes back against a simple one-sided story.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests, that the reality was much messier, much more complex.
Okay, moving forward in time, we hit the era of Western colonialism, another period often seen through a lens of Christian aggression.
Yes, people point to Vasco da Gama reaching India in 1497, the Portuguese taking Malacca in 1511. This expansion into Asia, often framed as purely Western Christian imposition.
But again, the source urges a bit more context here.
Right. It reminds us that this wasn't happening in a vacuum. You still had ongoing Muslim expansionist power, like the Ottomans capturing Constantinople just a few decades before Da Gama, or their siege of Vienna in 1529.
So it wasn't just Europeans expanding outward?
No. And there was a crucial economic driver for the Portuguese sea routes, too. Remember, the Ottoman Empire controlled the traditional land routes to Asia, the Silk Road.
Ah, right. So finding a sea route was a way around that control.
Essentially, yes. It was a way to bypass the Ottoman monopoly on trade. So it's this mix of religious zeal, political ambition, and hard economic realities driving things.
It paints a much more tangled picture of blame and motivation, doesn't it? Less black and white.
Absolutely. And the source makes a really important point here. These simplistic, one-sided historical narratives, they get used today.
How so?
As Propaganda fodder against Christians is the phrase used, especially in parts of Africa and Asia. It creates an unfair playing field, painting Christians purely as aggressors from the past.
I see. So understanding the historical complexity is actually quite relevant for present-day interactions.
Very much so. It guards against these, well, weaponized versions of history.
Okay, so despite this history of conflict, complexity, and sometimes legal restrictions, there were Christian efforts to engage with Muslims to share their faith, even early on.
Yes, though as you said, there were often restrictions. Under the historical dhimmi system in many Muslim lands, non-Muslims had protected status. But things like openly preaching to Muslims were often forbidden or heavily controlled.
But individuals still tried.
They did. John of Damascus is an early, significant figure around the 7th, 8th centuries. Interestingly, he came from a Christian family that served in the Muslim administration.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but he later became a monk and wrote quite critically about Islam. He saw it as fundamentally different, even calling it a forerunner of the Antichrist because of the different concepts of God.
That must have been incredibly risky for him.
Immensely risky. Then, fast forward a few centuries, you have figures like Francis of Assisi.
Right, his famous encounter with the Sultan in Egypt during a crusade around 1219. More symbolic, perhaps.
Very symbolic, yes. Preaching peace amidst war. But maybe even more influential in terms of strategy for missions was Raymond Lull in the 13th and early 14th centuries.
Lull, our source calls him one of the greatest missionaries. What was his approach?
He had a really clear three-pronged strategy. First, he insisted Christians had to learn the languages, especially Arabic.
Yeah.
He even pushed for language colleges.
Practical.
Very.
Yeah.
Second, he believed in using reason and logic, developing what he called rational apologetics to engage with Islamic theology, not just, condemning it.
Intellectual engagement.
And third, he knew it would be difficult. He stressed the need for missionaries to be willing to suffer, even face martyrdom. And he lived it. He made multiple trips himself, and tradition holds he was martyred.
Quite a figure. And then moving closer to modern times.
We see others building on this legacy. Henry Martyn, early 19th century crucial work, translating the New Testament into Urdu, Arabic, and Persian. Huge impact.
Making the texts accessible.
Exactly. Then Samuel Zwemer, often called the Apostle to Islam, working in Arabia and Egypt in the late 19th, early 20th century. He founded the Muslim World Journal, which was very influential for decades.
And William Shellabear?
His focus was Malaya, modern-day Malaysia, and Singapore. He did vital work translating the Bible into Malay.
And the source also highlights an Asian pioneer.
Yes, Dr. Cheok Chun from Korea. Significant as the first Korean woman missionary and the first Asian woman missionary sent to Pakistan more recently, passing away in 2016, shows the shift, the increasing involvement of the Asian church itself.
So a long history of dedicated individuals, translation work, attempts at engagement.
Absolutely. Real courage and commitment.
Yet, circling back to where we started with Garrison's data, all these efforts didn't seem to spark those mass movements until much, much later.
That's the puzzle, isn't it? Despite centuries of work by people like Lull, Martyn, Zwemer, these widespread turnings are overwhelmingly a phenomenon of the last few decades, especially the 21st century.
Which really begs the question, what changed? What's different now?
That's what we need to explore. Something seems to have shifted in the contemporary world.
Okay, let's dive into that shift then. Garrison's findings about the 21st century. You said 69 movements in just the first 12 years.
Right. And he maps these across the entire House of Islam, as he calls it, Dar al-Islam. He divides it into 9 big geocultural regions, or rooms.
Like North Africa, the Arab world, Persian world, Turkic regions, South Asia, Southeast Asia, that kind of thing.
Exactly, those kinds of broad areas. And his finding was that every single one of these 9 rooms had seen at least one major movement start in the 21st century.
Wow, so it's not just 1 or 2 hotspots, it's geographically widespread.
Very widespread, cutting across diverse cultures and contexts within the Muslim world.
Can you give us some concrete examples? Where are these movements happening?
Sure, let's look at a couple. Indonesia is a fascinating case, going back a bit further, actually linked to the political upheaval around 1965.
Right, after the failed coup attempt.
Yes. In the aftermath, there was a huge turning to Christianity. Estimates suggest maybe 2.5 million Muslims became Christians. And critically, the source notes many were from genuinely practicing Muslim backgrounds, not just nominal ones. And it's apparently still ongoing to some extent.
2.5 million. That's staggering. What about somewhere like Iran?
Iran is maybe even more surprising, given it's an Islamic republic with pretty pretty strict controls. Yet reports consistently speak of explosive growth in the underground house church movement.
Underground, so it's hard to get exact numbers.
Very hard, but the estimates mentioned range from over 100,000 up to potentially several million Muslim background believers, or MBBs as they're often called. It's considered one of the fastest growing churches in the world.
Incredible. And maybe one more example.
Let's take Algeria in North Africa.
Right.
Amidst all the political turmoil and violence they experienced, especially from the 90s onwards, reports emerged of significant church growth, particularly among the Berber people, but also Arabs.
Unofficial churches, presumably.
Mostly, yes. The source shares an anecdote, maybe slightly dramatic, but illustrative of a church leader, when questioned by authorities, claiming something like 80,000 members in his network. Whether the number is precise or not, it points to substantial growth in a region many wouldn't expect.
So Indonesia, Iran, Algeria, vastly different contexts, but a similar trend of significant growth. What could be driving this? The source connects it to broader geopolitical shifts.
It suggests that future missions, or maybe just the religious landscape generally, is going to be heavily influenced by what happens geopolitically, particularly in the Middle East.
Because of the historical influence of that region? Oil money?
Partly, yes. The influence of funding from oil-rich nations has been significant in global Islam. But now several destabilizing factors are converging.
Such as?
Well, existing political instability in many countries, obviously, but also the big drop in oil prices impacting those economies, plus the rise of alternative energy like solar, which could fundamentally shift global power dynamics.
Okay, economic pressures.
Then there's the renewed intensity of the Sunni-Shiite conflict, which we've seen play out horribly in places like Iraq, Syria, Yemen.
Yeah, that's reshaped the region.
Absolutely. And finally, the source mentions the phenomenon of ISIS and related extremism. Some see this as perhaps a kind of violent expression of Islam grappling with modernity, which might, paradoxically, lead some Muslims to question and look elsewhere.
So a volatile mix of political, economic, and ideological factors creating maybe openings, or at least changes.
That seems to be the implication, a period of flux and uncertainty where old assumptions might be breaking down for some people.
Which brings us to the role of the churches outside these regions, particularly the focus of our source, Asian churches.
Yeah.
How should they respond to all this?
Well, the source tackles a key debate within Christianity first. Should Christians even be trying to convert Muslims?
The dialogue versus evangelism question.
Exactly. There's a perspective, often associated with more liberal theology, that argues, given the history of tension and maybe ideas about universalism, all paths leading to God, the focus should be purely on dialogue and mutual understanding, not conversion.
But the author of our source takes a different view.
Yes, quite clearly. He argues for the traditional Christian understanding of a mandate to share the gospel message with everyone. He even draws a parallel to the Islamic practice of dawah, inviting others to Islam.
Kind of saying, if Muslims feel compelled to share their faith, Christians should too.
That's the parallel drawn. He quotes the Apostle Paul, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." For him, it's a core conviction. And given Garrison's findings of responsiveness, he argues the Asian church, in particular, needs to take this opportunity, this challenge, seriously.
But he also points out some challenges within the Asian church for doing that effectively.
Yes, a major one identified is a deficit in deep Islamic scholarship in many Asian seminaries. Not enough faculty who are really fluent in Arabic, who have a sophisticated, nuanced understanding of Islamic theology, law, history. The kind of expertise needed for serious engagement and effective training.
So what's the proposed solution?
Several things. Investing in training a new generation of Asian Christian scholars specializing in Islam. Staffing seminaries better with experts. Maybe even creating dedicated research and training centers focused specifically on mission to Muslims.
He notes a trend in some older Western centers, though, doesn't he? Moving away from that focus.
That's an interesting point. He mentions the Duncan Black MacDonald Center as an example of an institution originally founded very much for training missionaries to Muslims, which has, over time, shifted its emphasis more towards interfaith dialogue, a different priority.
And there's another critical issue raised, the persecution of Christians in Muslim-majority countries.
Yes, this is a really heavy and important part of the discussion. The author expresses concern that Western governments, and maybe even Western churches sometimes, haven't given enough attention or priority to the plight of persecuted Christians.
He cites some specific examples.
He references comments by Habib Malik regarding U.S. policy, and also the desperate appeals from church leaders in Syria during the Civil War who used the word genocide to describe what was happening to their communities.
Which puts a challenge to Asian churches as well.
Definitely. The question is posed, what can Asian churches, perhaps being geographically or culturally closer in some cases, do to actively help these suffering communities, to advocate for them, to stand in solidarity?
Beyond advocacy, what about the approach to outreach itself? What does the source emphasize?
Two things really stand out. First, the spirit of the engagement. It stresses the need for genuine servanthood, humility, and self-giving love. Referencing the Apostle Paul again, his attitude in 2 Corinthians. Many conversion stories apparently explicitly mention being drawn by seeing Christians live out this kind of love.
So the medium is part of the message, so to speak.
You could say that, action speaking louder than words, and second, an emphasis on prayer and reliance on the Holy Spirit. The source notes that many testimonies from Muslim background believers involve experiences described as signs and wonders, dreams, visions, healings playing a role in their journey, and also the crucial role of other MBBs in leading people to faith. It's not always external missionaries.
So it suggests a spiritual dimension that's perhaps beyond just human strategy or argument.
Very much so. It ends that section quoting Jesus' question in Luke. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? A call to perseverance in prayer and witness.
Okay, quite a journey through history, contemporary trends, and challenges. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main things you think we should take away?
Well, first, I'd say the sheer complexity of the history. We need to be really careful about simplistic narratives of blame, right? It's always more tangled.
Right. Avoid those propaganda fodder versions of history.
Exactly. Second, the surprising scale of the contemporary movements Garrison documents. It suggests something significant is happening in the 21st century, whether we fully understand why or not.
Yeah, that statistic is hard to ignore.
Third, the interplay with geopolitics, the instability, the economic shifts in the Muslim world. These seem to be creating a different context for religious identity and change.
A context that's still unfolding.
Definitely. And finally, the specific challenges and opportunities for the church, especially in Asia. The need for deeper understanding, the call to engage with love and service, the urgency of supporting persecuted brothers and sisters, and the fundamental reliance on prayer.
It really underscores why understanding both the past and the present is crucial if you want to be, properly informed about these global religious interactions. It's not simple stuff.
Not at all. It moves us way beyond sound bites into a much richer and frankly more challenging picture.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on, building on all this. If these reports of increasing numbers of Muslims exploring or embracing Christianity are accurate, what might the long-term ripple effects be? Thinking about interreligious relations, cultural shifts, even political landscapes, particularly in regions undergoing significant change, what could the future look like? Lots to consider there. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.